This is the second conversation of a two-part series with Jessie Mannisto. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about her, please check out the introduction I did in our first video. So you wrote this really great piece, and of course I'm going to link it in the notes, that talks about gender dysphoria and how it might overlap with overexcitability. And in this piece you interviewed several people. Some of them our viewers are probably going to be familiar with. So you interviewed Jessie and Helena from Peak Resilience Project, and you interviewed Carrie, Mars, and Mars is from the Trans Bro podcast, and a trans man named Alec, who I'm not really familiar with. But can you summarize a little bit about the article and what it was about?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier, or in our previous video, about how I had been introduced to this issue. And once you get into it, once you see what's going on, you're like, especially if you're intellectually intense, you start researching it. And I just wanted to know, like, what are these people thinking? And I looked for people who are having these experiences. And this was late in 2018 now, so almost a year and a half ago at this point. And I found all these people you mentioned, some of whom have gone on to do other things about detransitioning or being trans, and others who were just on Twitter, and I just found them talking about it, and they don't have a high profile. But I wanted to know, because a lot of the stuff I struggled with, like so many women who are now active trying to talk about this, like I had a hard time with the expectations put on me during adolescence as a girl, becoming a woman, and they were scary things. And for me, those all very clearly tied back to the concepts of overexcitability, which I was already talking about on my website. And when I interacted with these young people who were, especially the detransitioned women, and I made sure I used all like natal females or whatever natal females, we'll go with that, because I didn't want to, like, I just wanted that one cohort, like making the leap from this to FTM, and why did they do it, and who was happy with it and who wasn't, and so. Because I wondered about that overexcitability as experienced in a female body, and I was just asking this question: is what I'm seeing, does it have any value? Is there anything there? And I'm the first person to say, like, this is anecdotal. I hoped that somebody would see this and then run with it, who had the resources to do a proper study. So my article is just anecdotes, but they're interesting anecdotes because they were in line with what I was thinking. And maybe I selected those people. Maybe those are the ones I noted, but whatever. All of the detransitioned women had gone through this experience of overexcitability. What I ended up doing for all of them was to send them a questionnaire that was not so much focused on gender, except peripherally. It was more like, do you relate to these descriptions of overexcitability? Tell me how they mattered, and if you want, bring in stuff related to gender dysphoria. And it was very much the sort of thing that I thought I would see, which is the same thing that I had gone through as this intellectually inclined young woman who also overanalyzed things, and like, oh, pregnancy is scary, I'm being told that I have to have these priorities to be like this attractive woman, and like when I'm just myself and when I want to talk about ideas, people are intimidated by me. I had been told before, like, don't be smarter than the boys. Like, let the boys win. Otherwise they won't like you. And then I'm like, well, maybe I'm just going to opt out of this whole thing, you know? And there was no, like, I don't think I would have, I think I might have been one of those people who said I was like non-binary, because I understand not wanting to be this thing that we say is a woman, especially at that age when you're seeing all the things that are implied by it. When you have like super bad cramps, you're like, can I get rid of this? Like, I want to escape this. Yeah. So, yeah. And they talked about similar things to this, but also they talked about not feeling like putting aside the physical, which was definitely an element of it and causes the emotions to stir up because you feel trapped in your body. Yeah. Also the social role they were expected to fill, and that the role of the intellect in making them feel like they were not women. Because again, gifted women is an issue that people study, and they want to know, like, you know, because if you're expected to be feminine, where does being bright fit into that? And often it doesn't.
Gosh, there's so much there. I mean, first of all, I'll take us away and bring us back. So one thing that I thought about before I really came in contact with this theory of positive disintegration, or your article, was just that there's also something about the entire gender ideology that it's very cerebral. It requires you to think in these kind of abstract manners, and in some ways very concrete manners, but it's like a mental puzzle in a way. You know, you can be assigned male at birth, but you're really on the inside, you're a woman. And there's all of these kind of mental leaps that you have to do to really buy into the full thing. And I mean, what was really clear about your article is that everybody you interviewed had not really bought into the ideology in that particular way. But I don't find it shocking that Lisa Littman, for example, in her survey, her parent report survey of rapid onset or adolescent onset dysphoria, 47% of the kids were diagnosed as gifted. That's a lot. That is a high percentage. And those are the kids that got a formal diagnosis. Who knows how many of the kids were also overexcitable, but maybe they just never had it formally assessed. So to me, there's also something about this intellectual challenge of wrapping your mind around the ideology. And most of the kids that I've met, and I've consulted with like 500 families, most of these are kids who spend an exorbitant amount of time reading and trying to understand. And there's obviously this like intellectual desire to know more and understand more. And in kids I've worked with, it's like the more they research, the more they feel dysphoric. So I don't know. I feel like there's something that is also really tempting to a highly intellectually stimulable kid about this identity and this ideology. And to kind of go back to what you were saying about girls who are intellectually precocious, it's very hard when you're also developing this desire to be kind of part of the group, or if you are a slow developing in terms of your sexuality. Like, there are so many things wrapped up in that. And, you know, being desirable, you know, a lot of the kids are going through puberty, and that's a time when you start noticing whoever you're attracted to and wanting to be attractive to others. That's not necessarily a trait that we think about in teenagers of like, what makes you hot? It's not being intellectually precocious. It's being coy, or it's being sexy, or it's being flirty. And a lot of these kids, that just doesn't fit them. It's not how they operate. And so I can certainly understand feeling like, you know, maybe they think this is explicitly silly and dumb. I don't want to play this game, you know, and that's not me. So maybe that I'm not a girl. Maybe I'm not female after all. It's a lot.
Yes. I mean, yes to all of the above, I think, in different amounts for different kids. But, I mean, you made such a great point, which I hadn't thought of before, but yeah, like to follow this new way of looking at gender, it's like college course, like to learn what the different terms are and what they refer to, and like assigned at birth, and like, what does that even mean? And like, oh, well, how do I know what my gender is if it's not just like, I look at my body and it's pretty obvious. Like, of course that, like, if you're not really looking at these abstractions, you're not gonna be as interested in that unless something really pushes you. Like, I don't want to say like it will never happen, but it really draws upon that intellectualization. And that feels comfortable to this type of kid, you know, and it's the way they get. I mean, thinking back to my friend who wrote for Third Factor about like Spock and Data, like I have a system that I'm rationalizing and I can explain it to you and I can make the argument, like the profoundly gifted person who can always win the argument even when they're wrong. You know,
that's right.
That's how they function, and they just plow other people over with their definitions, and people throw up their hands, and they're gonna say like, whatever, man, I don't care. You do you. But yeah, and the idea of not wanting to play that game, like for me, this I remember discovering in the early 2000s the asexuality movement, because I was like, I don't want to play this game, you know. And in fact, some of your readers or listeners may be familiar with Julie Sandra Decker, who wrote the book An Introduction to the Invisible Orientation. And if you have ever looked at that book, my name is in the acknowledgments at the beginning because I read it as a draft, because like that was the earlier precursor, I think, to dealing with some of these same issues. And that's like, I'm kind of just naturally that way, but it's also very much like the result of being so cerebral that it's like, you know what, I'm going to opt out. Like I said, I don't want to go to the prom. This is a celebration of all this stuff that I'm actively rejecting because I've been rejected, because I'm intimidating, because no one thinks that's attractive. So I'm like, well, who cares about being attractive? Like, that's dumb. And like, amazingly, like I'm married and I have like a wonderful husband, and I didn't think I ever would. And a lot of my friends who are women who are also intellectually intense, they're not, you know, some of them are lesbians, and others are just like, this isn't working for me, like the whole dating relationship. So it remains a challenge, and somehow I made it work. I feel like that's not what I expected to go right in my life, but it did. Yeah. But it remains a challenge for this. Sadly. Yeah.
I think too about the sensual overexcitability, and you know, if you are both really intellectual and very sensual, and we mean sensual by like the senses, this is like a nervous system thing, right? So your senses just pick up more stimulation from the environment. And something interesting happens. Like I work with a lot of kids who are always up here, and on the other hand, they are so deeply craving for physical connection, which again, the internet kind of raises this other problem. So girls who have that craving for physical connection in some ways can be highly misunderstood, because if you are a really touchy-feely person and you want to like connect with your friends that way, that can be read as being just very sexual, which it may not be. And then that adds another layer of confusion for young girls who are feeling uncomfortable with their body. They don't want to be objectified. They don't want to be hypersexualized, yet maybe they're really liking physical touch and physical affection and being close with people. So, I mean, we could probably spend 2 more hours on this alone, but there are so many ways that being a teenager with these overexcitabilities can throw a wrench in the process of just developing with your own body as a female in society. It's really complicated.
Yes, absolutely true. Whether you are like actually having, because that can be part of it, the impulse to have a sexual experience can be part of overexcitability, or just like being oversensitive to like over intellectualizing the meaning and recoiling from it. All of these can come from the heightened, you know, responsiveness to stimuli. It can manifest in a lot of different ways, and I have seen it be that way. Even in the discussions at the Third Factor Forum, you see all the different ways that women are bringing up, like how the standard expectations for a teenage girl didn't fit them in this way. And then it makes you anxious, and it adds to your like the anxiety that you have, and you have a disintegration, to bring it back to this idea of positive disintegration, because what you're being told isn't fitting, and you're sad and you're being rejected, and you can't figure out why you're different, because maybe you don't understand about, you know, your overexcitability, your heightened responsiveness to these things, and that you're being so cerebral, you're intellectualizing it, you're seeing all the bad things that can happen that other people don't even bother to stop to think about. There's so many ways that it throws up challenges.
I don't want to get off topic here, but what just popped up in my mind is also the way there is this very premature, I think, introduction of sexual concepts to young children. And if you are someone with these sensual overexcitabilities, maybe you are a sexual person, and that's fine too. But how do these kind of philosophies about sexuality and embracing every single sex act that you could possibly imagine, like how does that play into the development of a young person who does have these overexcitabilities? And I mean, it's just very complicated. And I am so grateful every day that I was born when I was born in the early 80s. And I was able to, I mean, there are, of course, challenges for every era, but I was able to grow up largely without all of this noise around what my body means, what do connections with others mean, what does my intensity mean. I feel very grateful that I was kind of spared all of that.
I know. I mean, I also was born in the early 80s, and I had a hard enough time. Like,
I know.
To be clear from what I'm talking about here, right? Like, oh, you know, skipping the prom, asexuality, like all of this stuff, and stuff that I saw online that was like sexual and like maybe, I don't want to like shame anybody, but like for a teenage girl, you're kind of like, whoa, like I didn't need to know about that.
Right.
You're not even looking for it. It gets thrown at you. Even in the golden age of the internet, as they call it, the 1990s. And I look at what kids are seeing now and what they say about what they're exposed to with like porn is everywhere. I would have been broken. So, you know, I would have really needed a lot more therapy. So I have so much sympathy for these kids nowadays and the parents who are trying to help them guide them through this, and to come away without being just totally damaged and get a really distorted view of what is going to be expected of you in a relationship. It's just horrifying on in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And it's no shock to me. The data shows that kids these days are hitting the kind of milestones of I don't want to say development, that's not the right word, but kind of like life experience milestones at a much later age. Like teens today are having less sex, experimenting with drugs a lot less. And, you know, when you look at that on the surface, of course, that looks like a positive, but I'm really curious about why, because it's not like teen development is somehow different. It's not like their brains are that different, but what is going on where kids are not actually diving into these experiential embodied experimentations? And some of it has to do, of course, with just like being really sensitive, kind of like maybe your experience. Like I was a really late bloomer when it comes to romance and sexuality, like very late. But you know, what would have happened if we were also bombarded with like very graphic images, like when you're not even looking for them, like things like that. So I'm not shocked that kids are developing really late. Yeah,
for sure. I know. I saw that headline and I immediately thought like, oh, that's great. Wait a minute.
Yeah. And so maybe it will just take them time, you know, like I imagine that just like with all the detransitioners, you know, a lot of times they say just being out there in the real world, realizing that there's an experience of life outside of these internet kind of circles that can kind of bring someone to a maturing place. And I hope that that's true.
Yeah. I know that's like, if any young people are watching this, that's my advice. Get off the internet. And I'm saying this right now, as we said in the earlier video, this is the time of COVID. Everything's on the internet and everything is harder for me now because I'm not like, I realize that that's important to me, and it's really driving home how much it matters to not be mediating everything through a screen.
For sure. Mm-hmm. And ironically, here we are on screen talking to each other.
I know. It's also great. It's got a great flip side, but you should have it. You should keep it in your life, but you should make sure it's not your whole life.
That's right. Everything has two sides. Everything does.
Yeah.
So I'm going to read a little quote here. One thing that struck me about your article was that when you talk to all these people who were born natally female, but the two trans men didn't really feel like they related with the word intensity. And I thought that was interesting because, I mean, I know I got to speak with Mars. I know him, and obviously he's a really independent thinker, right? And he has refused to follow norms just because they exist or they're socially reinforced. So he obviously thinks for himself. He has probably been called the wrong kind of trans. I think that's like a hashtag that we see on Twitter. So I don't know if that means that Mars is intense, but I wondered about that word intense and whether it has certain connotations that we wouldn't even apply to men. Like I've never heard people saying, I mean, I've said that men are intense, but I don't hear that word being used for men much. And I'm wondering, what do you think of that?
That's such a great question. And I wish I should have analyzed it for the article, because it's so true, right? They didn't. The two trans men who I talked to who are happy being trans men, you know, they're not compared to the detransition women. For women, for people who are going to live their life being seen as a woman, being told you're intense is like, whoa, you're intimidating. But for a man, it's like, you're commanding, you're authoritative, it's received very differently. And I don't know, like, there's also interesting questions that I have no business trying to answer and only asking, like, what is the effect of taking testosterone and like the hormones and like how that affects, how you're making peace with these traits. Like, I have no idea. That's very interesting. So maybe there's something like that going on too. But just talking about the socialization, it's, when I read their responses, the trans men they were less like, oh yeah, overexcitability is a thing, but you could see the residue of it. Like, I felt comfortable saying, like let's talk about Mars, because you know Mars. He is definitely, he falls under the intellectually overexcitable, like, even if you wouldn't use that word, like, because he's chill and stuff, he still has these elements in his behavior, like truth seeking and not putting up with people's nonsense is really a highlight of this. And you can be more laid back about it. There's a stereotypical masculine way to do it, and some women also do that, and other women funnel it a different way, whether naturally or because they were trained to do it. But yes, it's obvious that he's one of these type of like question askers, which is a big thing that we do at Third Factor. Like, these are the people who are always butting heads with people, and now Mars is butting heads in a different way and not feminine way, but he's still doing it. Well, I'm thinking too, I mean, I don't work with lots of natal males, but something that I have observed this is just purely a theory, is that natal males who have developed gender dysphoria also imagine that if they were operating in the world as a woman, they could be much more expressive and maybe intense. So when I think about what the word intense means, it's being able to kind of like express your strong emotions as they come up for you, being able to just kind of say what you think right away, and working with just a few dysphoric males, it seems like there's a sense that as a male, I have to be subdued. I really have to keep it chill. I have to be kind of nonchalant. And, I've often thought about this as a younger person and as a woman. I feel very lucky that I'm allowed to go like if I want to. It doesn't mean people are always going to take me seriously, because we also discredit women's opinions because of how they express them, right? But I do think that a lot of times dysphoric males imagine just kind of like a freer existence in terms of letting their personality out and having room for intensity. Because also, I mean, to be fair, I think you're right that we see men who are intense as passionate and things like that, but we may also think that they're being aggressive. Like, that might have changed culturally, but today, if a guy is really intense, people might be like, okay, like, cis white guy, calm down, like you're being aggressive or you're intimidating people. So, I mean, anyone can intimidate anyone. I've been called intimidating too, but I really do wonder if that imagination for dysphoric men is that they'll be able to express more freely without having to tamp it down. Well, that's such a good point. And here I am giving the female perspective, right? On like, men get to do this, but I didn't get to do this. But it's absolutely true. If you look back at, we talked about Paula Prober and her idea of reinforced mind. She works with gifted clients, and she has some really good articles up there about that are for different, for men and for women. And she talks about the women feeling intimidating, but she also talks about the gifted men who tend to be more sensitive, and they struggle with that. So, like, exactly what you described, it would make total sense to me that could be why a dysphoric boy or man wants to transition. Like, that completely makes sense.
Because we're all playing a role to some degree. I mean, we would be completely unhinged if we all just let it completely loose. And so those roles, of course, they are gendered. I mean, as much as we like to say, well, is it biology? Is it social? I mean, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, because there are still these boxes that exist. And for a lot of males, I do think that's a factor. So, so we talked a little bit about intellectually precocious female children. And just to kind of tie that together, I wanted to read something that Helena said, I think in your article. She said, I want people to know that a lot of these traits, being highly intellectual, passionate, and creative, they're traits that are demonized or made fun of in women, but praised in men. It's no wonder we identify with manhood when, as far as society is concerned about personality traits, we are. And this, when I read this, it really did make me think about what we discussed earlier about if a person is highly sensitive to the way people react to them, that's going to heighten this, isn't it? Because by definition, if someone has like an I don't give an F attitude about how the world reacts to them, then they're not even going to relate to this. They're going to say, what are you talking about? Nobody tells us how to act. Like, we can do whatever we want. But if you're someone who's highly attuned to the messages coming from around you, you're going to notice all the times when you are criticized for being that way.
Yeah.
So it's not like this is objectively always true, but it is going to feel true for someone who's sensitive to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And why are they sensitive to it? Whether it's innate, it's probably, I'm not an expert, it's probably innate sometimes, or maybe you've just been beaten too many times and that if you're not sensitive to it, consequences will happen and people won't like you. So you develop that sensitivity. Maybe it's, a little of both for different people. And there she is talking about what we just spent a while talking about. We all care what other people think of us to some degree. And some people are lucky to just be more like, and I think it comes with maturity too, because of course, like you were saying, teenagers are learning how to get along with people and you want acceptance. You need that sort of thing. But you maybe, if you've struggled to get acceptance because you're unusual in any way, and you're inclined to be sensitive, that could be a vicious circle right there.
Yeah. And kids can be particularly mean. Like, I remember in middle school and high school, there is such a lack of compassion in young people about the person who's kind of the oddball or the person that doesn't fit in. And we have all these campaigns, these anti-bullying campaigns, and I think they're great because they kind of get kids to be attuned to that. But I don't think that comes organically, even for the nicest kids. I mean, I'm thinking about, the stereotypical cafeteria scene where the really sweet, sensitive, nice kids who maybe they have a small group of friends, they're together. Are they really inclined to go up to the person who's all by themselves and say, hey, do you want to sit with us? Like, no, even the great kids in high school are not primed to do that. So the sensitivity is really heightened at that particular period of time.
For sure. I make a little digression, but it fits here. I'm working on a novel. I'm working on a middle grade novel. That's something I've wanted to do. It's an idea I had when I was that age, and I'm trying to write it again now. And it kind of is positive disintegration and being an exceptional person, but not in those words, obviously. Yeah. And I realized, it wasn't quite cohering. The plot wasn't quite going the way I wanted to. And I realized I made my characters too nice. My main character's friends were too forgiving of her, or they would have been like, come on, you're annoying. And I didn't want to do that because I was relating to my character and I cared. I thought her friends were they were nice people. They were nice people. Yeah. But even the nicest ones are gonna, kids express annoyance with each other. People express annoyance with each other, but kids haven't necessarily learned how to do it more effectively. Yeah. Or how to restrain those strong feelings
Totally,
kids are not,
totally.
Kids are rough. You can't idealize childhood.
That's right. Oh God, we could spend a long time on that. You really cannot. Children are not little monks and saints running around. That's just not how it works.
No.
And they're also not terrible, right? Adolescence is also not a reason to completely discount what somebody thinks. But we do have this tendency to think children are innocent and perfect and they would all get along if only society would let them be. But I don't know if that's true.
Yeah, no, it's not.
Yeah.
Kids are wonderful. People are wonderful, but people have a dark side. And that's true at every age.
Yeah. Well, I was also thinking a little bit about kind of the baggage of being female. I don't know if I included this in our notes, but the kids I talk to often say, I don't know exactly what it means to think I'm a guy, but I know I'm not a girl. And when you start digging into that, you realize all of the associations that we have. And again, this is true on the side of dysphoric males, right? But there are all these associations that we have with what it means to be a woman versus what it means to be a guy. And it's hard for kids to separate the fact that they don't have to identify with those associations, but they can still be themselves. And I mean, I remember as a young person being very like against anything having to do with pregnancy or having kids. And I mean, if I had this rhetoric, I think I would have said, God, being a woman sucks. It's dumb. And I mean, now I'm so grateful. I'm so happy to be a woman. But there is this way that we have a hard time at that age separating out the baggage from the essence of what that actually means.
Yes. Yeah. I remember a job I had as a teenager. I worked at Borders, and I remember like I would see pregnant women come into the store, and I would get woozy because I would immediately jump to like I would be envisioning in my head as a teenager what it would feel like to give birth.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
And I could picture it. I can imagine things too. I mean, that's imaginational overexcitability. You can imagine it too readily. And that's why imagination is related to anxiety. But it can also, you know, this is like life, the biological kingdom has put a heavy burden on the shoulders of women. And so, but then we talk about like the other stuff we think of as that it means to be a woman. And you say like, well, I don't know, like even putting aside pregnancy, which is a different thing you can be stressed about, like we said. The other stuff we think like, well, I know I'm not that thing that I think a woman is. And that's like where I really, as much as I understand a lot of, like I have sympathy for a lot of the stuff around gender dysphoria and the dialogue around it. But when it comes to like the idea that you're saying like, well, that's what a woman is and I'm not that, like, I really want to push back on that in a way that I hope is helpful to some growing young people. Like, no, that stuff that you think is what a woman is, it's not. You can be all these other things. Like you can play hockey. You know, I played hockey. I was terrible, by the way. I was really bad at it. But, you know, and like, I tried to do it. Like, you can do that. I was thinking, you know, the 90s were a good time to grow up because for all we're trying to do to put women, and probably also true for people of color, but I'll just speak for women, forward and say how like girl power and it's great. I was watching, it happened, I was talking to a parent and we were talking about good kid shows and we started talking about the old PBS game show, Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego? That was on. Yeah, you're about my age, you probably remember that too. And so I found it on YouTube and I was like, oh yeah, I liked that. I was a nerd. So here I am putting myself down, right? I was a nerd. The chief is a Black woman. And like that, I was so grateful to look back and see, like, I took that for granted, you know? And the more we try to say that, you know, it's okay to, you know, to be a woman, let's show you women. I wonder if that sometimes doesn't also send the message to a very highly sensitive child, like, wait, why are you telling me that women can do that? You know, Yes. This is about the explicit versus the implicit. So just seeing Carmen Sandiego, the head detective lady or whatever, without having to name it and point it out and like shine a bright light on it, we just implicitly, I mean, we trusted her. We knew she was the leader. We thought she was really cool. And that was really powerful. And I definitely agree with you because a lot of times, you know, girls, they don't want to be an awesome female writer. They just want to be a writer. And just a person.
Yes, just a person. And there is this weird way that the more we try to push female empowerment in this explicit fashion, it becomes tokenized, and nobody wants to be tokenized. And I remember, I mean, I also have a different ethnic background, and I've had all kinds of identity struggles trying to sort out what that means. And as a woman, I mean, for sure, there's all kinds of projections we make onto women. But what I've come to believe is that the best way to show the world who you are is just living your life. Just do what interests you, express yourself in a way that makes sense. But if you are constantly trying to do it as an Arab woman or as a this, as a that, it actually really limits you and it makes you so self-conscious. And like another thing that I see is sometimes there are girls who actually really, really like certain things that are feminine. Like, I mean, I think there are a lot of makeup artists, they're incredibly talented, really gifted, creative people. And I've met a lot of girls who they want to play with makeup, but they feel like, well, because I identify as non-binary, I can't, because it's going to confuse people, or I'm not supposed to like this because, so it becomes really a problem when we become overly focused on labels and naming things and trying to categorize things and making ourselves so conscious of what we intuitively like. And I mean, I remember even a conversation with a kid who really, really liked this one Britney Spears song, but would never tell anybody about it because it's Britney Spears. She's so girly and I'm not girly. And I remember it just came to me at the time, but I said, what do your ears like? What are your ears like? Forget the gender thing. What are your ears interested in? And to me, I'm highly like a sensual person. So for me, it's pretty easy to tap into what music makes me just sway. I don't have to like analyze what genre it is, or what do I like to eat, what tastes good, what feels nice, what lotion smells good. But if I was analyzing that, like I remember going through a phase where I was reading a lot of radical feminist literature, and though I still appreciate it at some point, I started questioning, why do I like lotion? Like, it was the silliest thing. I really got wrapped up in it. And I was like, is this me just buying into this like patriarchal idea that my skin has to be soft? And what I ended up realizing is it feels so wonderful to smooth like a silky, warm concoction onto your body. And that is, to me, that's so much more valuable than hyper analyzing what every single thing that we like means about us.
Yeah. Oh, that's so true. Like, what prison are you putting yourself in with this analysis? Like, why are you analyzing the world this way? What injustice are you trying to end? And are you really ending it? Or are you just creating more problems and hurdles for yourself? I also think of this with respect to, because I think that this positive disintegration and overexcitability are especially relevant to creative, specifically the creatively gifted people with that impulse to, because you're taking in so much stuff, you have to put it out somewhere. And so that makes you an artist. Like Dabrowski studied artists. And the more you're trying to serve a identity label, the more that's taking your mental energy, the less you have to give to something else that might be what you would choose. So you had this box that was probably useful to you at some point, but now you're stuck in it. You have outgrown it and you can't fit in it anymore. And maybe you don't know that you can step out of it. And I just, for creative kids, like you don't have to keep doing this. You can be free of it all.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I want to tell them.
Well, freedom is a big theme that I end up discussing with kids, because a lot of times when we try to really analyze, well, what would be the opposite of gender dysphoria? I mean, if we could imagine it conceptually, it would be a freedom to just kind of be present with whatever you're experiencing and not have this continual kind of internal track in your mind of self-consciousness and focusing on gender. So I love that you brought up freedom. And this kind of leads us into the last kind of set of points that I wanted to talk about, which is finding your authenticity. I've been reading this book by Hilary Jacobs Hendel, and I've talked about it a lot, so I probably sound like a broken record, but she talks about how being able to fully experience our core emotions allows us to be authentic, because that's really, like, in some ways, this is what we're talking about, that people who are overexcitable will have very strong core emotions as triggered by various like stimuli in their environment. And to be able to actually experience that, ride the wave of those emotions, that helps you tap into who you are authentically. And, you know, I think it's important to just say, I do think for some people, trans identity is a way to be their authentic self. I don't think that trans identity is always necessarily like a derailing of authenticity. But at least for a lot of the kids I work with, I do think it can become a trap, which is like what we talked about earlier of like, is this a box that you're kind of forcing yourself into? So there's a way in which they could be avoiding that kind of higher level of disintegration by saying, you know, I am not understanding these things about myself, rather than kind of moving up and trying to get past all of this silly gender stuff, I'm going to box myself in. And so I'm wondering what comes up when you think about that, as gender identity is a way sometimes to actually derail your authenticity, and instead just kind of moving into what the status quo is saying.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and it's a great way to bring it back. Authenticity is considered a dynamism in Dabrowski's theory of positive disintegration. And a dynamism is the term for like the processes themselves, like the forces within us that disintegrate and reintegrate. And authenticity is a level 4 dynamism, which means it's now reintegrating you.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting, like being very intellectually overexcitable, I don't feel obliged to say that like, oh yeah, Mars is like a good kind, like that's a healthy trans thing. But I really think that like watching him, yeah, like of course I haven't abandoned the idea that gender transition can be helpful for some people. Like there seems to be a lot of evidence that it can be. It's just a question of who is it helping and why. And this cohort that we've been talking about being stuck in the box, like that's really happening. I really think that people are trapping themselves. But what about the people who aren't, you know? And it looks to me like the people who make that transition, and then that enables them to let things go, to have the freedom, rather than trapping themselves and feeling like, oh, am I living up to that identity that I have to prove to everyone that is right for me. The more it lets you just let it go. That's a really hard thing to answer. Like, I'm sure that's like a key thing for your work. It's not an easy question, and it's not easy to predict going forward, but Mars is a great example of that, because he shows that, hey, I've chosen autonomy, which is separate from authentism, but those are both level 4 dynamisms. Like, I thought this through for myself. I asked the tough questions. I stood up in the face of answers that I didn't like. But I engaged with them, and I wasn't scared. And like, this is me. And like, you can say I'm the wrong kind of trans, but this is me. And like, that to me really speaks to what it means to be reintegrated. Mars, I'm sure he's still got things he's struggling with. Like, you don't have to have it all down to say, you know, you've reintegrated this part of yourself. But yeah, I mean, what a great example of that. And the idea that these dynamisms of authenticity and autonomy, the way they are reintegrating forces, and that they, you know, you want to feel like you're being authentic, but it's the reason there are high-level dynamisms, it's really hard, you know? You have to listen to that third factor, that autonomous voice within yourself, and sort it out from the second factor pressures, the peer pressures, from what other people are telling you. And that's not something we do necessarily easily without practice. Coming back again to like, you have to practice these skills.
Yeah. I think, again, kind of about things on a developmental pathway, and you know, I worry about the way identity can be medicalized, and I think identity is being fed to young people as a way to self-actualize, kind of skipping steps without doing the work. But I also think that for a lot of young people that I have met, this is a currently available way that they can move towards autonomy. And I wish that it didn't always have to be medicalized, because then you end up with the physical scars of your individuation forever, even if it stops serving you, right? That's the real big problem. But I think there are lots of young people who have gone through an aspect of medical transition and some period of time where they identified as trans, and they did disintegrate in a positive way. And sometimes that means they stay in that presentation. Sometimes they detransition. And, you know, I'm really unsure of how to grapple with that, because as a therapist, I think it would be better if they could just bypass that whole thing and find a different way to disintegrate in a positive manner. But sometimes I think, I don't know if there was another way for these kids. You know, we cannot help the time period that we're born into, or the culture we're born into, or kind of the current climate we're born into. And I think for some young people, taking some of these steps can be something that maybe is inevitable. I don't know if that makes sense. And I hope that that is not taken the wrong way. Because of course, as a therapist, I always try to steer my clients towards being much more clear and careful about what they're doing.
Yeah.
But sometimes I think we are just dealing with this particular phenomena right now. And I don't know if there's like a magic way to get around it if you are in the grips of gender identity.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, you just hit on one of like the fundamental issues of life right there, I think, right? Like that's a really true and heavy observation. And in fact, it brought to my mind, in that book I talked about earlier, the new book by Scott Barry Kaufman called Transcend, which I recommend. It's really good. We're reading it at Third Chapter right now. It talks about, I don't remember who said it, but it was a passage that was quoted where the speaker says, you know, he learned so much about being a human when his son died. And of course, he doesn't want his son to have died. But the fact that he went through this shaped him in a way that he is proud of, that is who he is now. And of course, he would give it all back. If he could have his son be alive, then screw the growth. Like, I don't want that. But that's how life is. You know, we make bad decisions or decisions that will not ultimately serve us. We face crises, things are taken from us, we have loss. Like, you can't be shielded from all of that. It is not possible. And you're right, like this is a thing that is happening right now that, we try to shield people from things. We don't want to let your kid die so that you can grow. You know, we'll try to keep that kid alive. But, and so, of course you want to try to keep people from having to make those choices. But I also really do admire these detransitioned people I follow who, and it's usually the women because that's the one that's harder to get rid of, but I think for men too, there's issues, that it's really interesting at how they have grown through like post-traumatic growth. Like, I think that's what it's called, right? They have this post-traumatic growth. And so, but it's, you're walking a fine line, right? Like, you don't want to overly romanticize it, but they're impressive people. And it shows that they have gone through a positive disintegration.
For sure.
Yeah. But it can still really hurt. And it's, you don't want to have a positive disintegration just, you know, if you can help it, because it's still a disintegration and it's still painful, really painful and scarring.
And I think about this a lot because I work with families who parents are understandably terrified. And yet, as a therapist, I really, really believe we have to be careful about how we frame the experiences of people who go through this, you know? And again, everything has multiple angles to it. I really believe that in 40 years from now, there are going to be documentaries and books written about this unusual surge in gender dysphoria. I think it maps on to all kinds of other kind of psychic phenomena that we've seen, multiple personality disorders, but people who have been through it, we should be really careful not to say, oh, well, they were just kind of the damaged remnants of this weird phenomenon. No way. Humans are quite resilient and quite amazing. And I always just try to create space for that in my work, and also try to help parents to understand, be careful about how you're understanding your child, because they're also an autonomous being in this bizarre time, right? But they're still autonomous and they can make something out of this experience. Yes, that's absolutely true. Yeah. Well, there are a couple other kind of things I wanted to touch on. One thing that we talked about a little bit was this asynchrony. And this is something that I see a lot with gifted kids, where they have these intellectual abilities, but we talked earlier, they don't necessarily have the wisdom. And I just wanted to read a quote, particularly, I think, about adolescence. So it says, there may be immense discrepancies in how aspects of the gifted child's potential core are expressed. A gifted child may have the cognitive capability of a person many, many years older, enclosed in an exceptional typical or delayed physical development and augmented by exceptionally average or stunted social emotional functioning. This enormous variance and asynchrony of functioning can feel overwhelming for the sensitive and intense gifted adolescent. So what I often see that this reminds me of is that kids who are really intelligent can also convince the adults in their life that their research about gender dysphoria and their certainty about it is more believable because of how intellectual they are. And I wonder too if, you know, the activists who advocate for the affirmation only approach, they always say, you know, like, listen to the kids, they know what they're talking about. And I feel really conflicted about that because, yeah, they can be very convincing, but does that necessarily mean that they have the maturity and foresight to know exactly how they're going to feel in 4 years, 5 years, 10 years? So I find this asynchrony can really throw not only kids off because of their own development, but the adults in their life.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great, to use asynchrony that way. Yeah. And what caught me, what flagged in my mind when you were speaking is, you just talked about activists. Like, I was in the Democratic Socialists of America, and I was in it, they transformed, like, the organization changed overnight when Trump was elected. So I'm not with them anymore, because they used to be more of a place where you could be a devil's advocate. Like, to call yourself a socialist before Bernie Sanders came around was like, whoa, what's wrong with you? And so you had to be willing to explain. And here's the important part. You had to be willing to accept that the people you were talking to were likely to be very skeptical of what you were saying. And so it was a place where these sort of people who wanted to question, but they knew the burden was on them to convince people. And then it changed to this new form of activism that is fueled, I think, by a lot of emotional intensity, this overexcitability. When I was in DSA, old DSA, as some of us call it now, and new DSA, both of them, but in different forms, I'm looking at it through this lens of positive disintegration. I'm like, wow, these are overexcitable people to bother being activists, right, in the first place. Otherwise, you're not gonna be motivated. And yeah, so these activists who then say in the transgender movement, like, listen to them. They, you have to trust your young person. Like, they may have felt those very strong emotions, and so they want to advocate for other people who are also feeling them. But they don't know each kid. For every child who's going to go on to be a happy, well-adjusted trans person and should have been, wished that they were validated earlier, they don't know if, like, this is where we get the brushing aside of the detrans experience. Like, and the idea that we each have a unique path to walk in life is really important to remember, that what was right for someone else isn't necessarily right for this person here. And it's so hard. You have to get to know that person and what they're really thinking, which speaks to the need for a therapist to ask questions, just to make sure that they're learning something about themselves, and they're not and they're sorting out whatever their path forward is. And the idea that I can't get over the fact that the idea that a therapist who says any path forward is okay, it is okay for you to be trans, but let's talk this through, because there are reasons that people reject or regret this, and reasons that people thrive with it. What are you? We want to know you. Like, that's the most compassionate thing that a person can do. Even though the activist is speaking from a place of wanting to help a certain person be heard, they're forgetting to get to know the individual. And they're brushing aside the people who want to do that. And I think that's really sad.
Well, it's very much a one-size-fits-all approach, which actually, in an ironic way, really destroys the individual, identity has to do with one person's identity. So that's really a big problem, because it does not take into account the uniqueness of each person's situation. Yeah. Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about arrested development, because I read this and it really reminded me of something I'm seeing a lot. I'm going to, again, kind of read something from Living with Intensity here. So when I think about arrested development in like layman's terms, I'm thinking about like the Peter Pan syndrome, the kid who kind of gets stuck and doesn't want to grow up.
Yeah.
So it says, this observed trend occurs as a result of exceptional sensitivity of the highly DP child. What's DP?
DP is that developmental potential.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So arrested development occurs when an external factor or factors cause injury or significant pain, resulting in fragmentation or dissociation. This could include everything from benignly non-validating environments where a child simply feels painfully out of place to an overly counter-validating environment where the child experiences actual abuse. Minor incidents that occur over time can cause lesions in the psychic fabric of the individual. Aspects of the growing child remain fixed at that age or level of functionality as a result. Typically, access to the injured site is difficult, and the individual becomes well defended through a variety of mechanisms. This is particularly the case with gifted individuals whose levels of complexity are intertwined, sometimes quite creatively. It cannot be emphasized enough that the external factors may seem to others benign, but to the child, they can be developmental, noxious, debilitating, or even deadly. These factors can cause a tyrannical imbalance in the homeostasis of the growing child. So a lot of kids I see, a lot of families I've consulted with describe some kind of precipitating event to the onset of dysphoria. And a lot of times that will be something that seems benign if we just thought about its ubiquity, like, you know, their best friend stopped talking to them, or the person they were in love with got a girlfriend, or, I mean, respectively little things, but just caused such an incredible amount of distress in the child that they became very depressive. They started this kind of disintegrative path. They isolated themselves. They just kind of zoned in their online worlds. And so I just thought that was so interesting, because there is a bit of a Peter Panning that happens with dysphoria, especially if we think about the recommended steps forward. Mm-hmm. You get a new name. You throw away all your girl stuff. You get a new identity. You start introducing yourself. There's almost like a rebirth of a new person, starting from scratch. You're all of a sudden new. You have to relearn how to exist in the world. And I don't know if it gets any more concrete than that when you think about the person kind of getting stuck or fixated at that particular developmental level. So that just kind of blows me away. And I wish there was more psychological curiosity about this, because it's so rich. But what about that? What about that arrested development? Can you share with us?
Yeah. I mean, just that passage that you read is so resonant I think to most of the people I have come to know through Third Factor, that even there's a Pearl S. Buck poem about the truly sensitive, the creative and sensitive. You know the one I'm talking about? You're nodding.
No, I'm just nodding about Pearl S. Buck, but go ahead.
Look this up, because creative people put it everywhere. To the truly creative person in any field, a touch is a blow. You know, it's all these things. Like the little thing becomes huge. Everything gets blown out of proportion to this creative individual. And I know, like, I shared this with a lot of people, and they're like, "Oh yeah, oh my God!" They all put it that, like, back when we all had like web pages that we coded and we put it as like at the top of our page, like as the epigraph. And because, and then and if you don't want to go forward because you feel like somehow you've been damaged or you didn't get it right, bringing back the perfectionism, you're not fitting that mold. So, you want to start from scratch. You want it to be fresh. And then add to that another thing with the Peter Pan syndrome is that being an adult is daunting. I think that's pretty universal. I mean, some people are really excited about it, but even they are probably like, whoa. This is hard. And it also really strikes me with the idea of being non-binary, which is like the things that kids are rejecting at adolescence are often with the maturing body that marks you as male or female. And you just you don't want any of that. You want to go back to when you were a kid and bodies were not complicated and they were not differentiated meaningfully between boys and girls. You could all play on the same sports team, and it didn't matter who you were friends with, and it wasn't complicated. childhood, as much as we were saying, like, there's bad things about childhood, it's safe and known. And
Oh
it's
my
less,
gosh. Yeah.
Yeah. You want to stay there, of course.
Kids are not getting their driver's licenses. They don't want to drive. They don't want to be sexual. I mean, I think there's so many general factors that are happening in adolescence that point to this syndrome of wanting to stay in childhood. And I mean, that's one of the tasks, is to differentiate. And I think for some kids, even though it's not objectively safe, I think playing with identity this way feels like some kind of way to differentiate, but not in a way that truly brings about the life experience and the challenges and ushers in the difficulty of like powering into adulthood. You know, it's like this, it's kind of fantasy based. I mean, a lot of the kids I work with are also really artistic and very creative. And so it's this fantastical way of taking on a new identity and kind of running from the adulthood that you imagine in your own gender. And for girls, I mean, we've touched on some of the reasons they might be afraid to grow up. And I'm even thinking about kids whose parents might have painted a very pragmatic picture of what it means to have a career, you know, and they're like, I don't want to do that, clock in some boring ass like 9-to-5 job for the rest of my life. No, thank you. So there's a lot of ways that kids might be defending against the inevitabilities of growing up in what they see as maybe something they don't want to partake in.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and Peter Pan is a resonant story for a reason.
Yes.
Everyone remembers what was scary about growing up. And the notion of not getting your driver's license, my husband, who again is another one of these overexcitable types, he is 37 and he has a driver's permit right now. So he can't take public transit right now because of COVID. I don't want him to do that. So I'm driving him to work at the moment. So get your driver's license, kids, and don't make spouse teach you how to drive when you're 37.
Public service announcement.
And then he's mad at me because I'm like, I'm air braking. You're like, stop. And he gets mad. I'm like, hey, I didn't sign up for this. So
yeah, you're like, if you're in the passenger seat, you got to deal with my driving.
Yeah. If you don't deal with it as a kid, you're going to have to deal with it eventually. Like, that's life.
Sure.
And it's tough.
Yeah.
But,
and I mean, so much of childhood defending is escape, you know, just trying to put things off as long as possible. I mean, in some ways, you know, you hear a lot of detransitioners talk about all the time they lost, you know, and it's like a weird procrastination of life. And again, I mean, if I were to work with someone in therapy who's experiencing that framing, I would try to honor it, but eventually help them reframe it, because really you wouldn't know anything about yourself had you not gone through this huge derailment.
Yeah.
That would be the ultimate goal of like trying to frame it. But there's something to that, right? That people feel like they've lost a lot of time. They put off life for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard that. It's a certain element. It's tragic, but it also is like, don't underestimate what you have learned through it about yourself. So it's. I mean, that's what I was talking about with the creative people. Like, think of what you could have been doing, but instead you were trapped in a box. And that's time you don't get back. Life is short. Here we are being like the wiser adults, being like, life is short, kids. Like, you don't know that, but it is.
Yeah. It makes me think too about how like women often, female people often really, I don't know how to frame this, but they experiment on themselves rather than onto the world. So I don't want to generalize, right? But I often find, and I think this is true for my experience as well, but like when you think about the life lessons and how women tend to learn those, it's often through experimenting with their own relationships or their own relationship with their body. Like it's a kind of like internal, it's like a close cipher of where they go to experiment with life. And I think real freedom happens when you can kind of move outside of yourself. I mean, I think there's value to the way women tend to do that, but I think real freedom is when you can move beyond yourself and actually be in the world, interacting with the world, you and the world.
The idea of agency. We keep coming back to the word agency and the work I'm doing at Third Factor. That's what people want, and they all haven't necessarily learned how to have it. They keep themselves small so as not to, overwhelm other people, or they just don't realize that they do have the power to change things that they may not like because they were discouraged as younger people. But yeah, agency is like a magic word.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, to kind of bring back the idea of groups, like there's something really interesting that happens when you have a particular group that is telling you the way you gain agency is by continually modifying your body and your identity. And so it's like this way of saying, hey, we have a group, you can come be with us. And, are you feeling a lack of agency in your life? Well, inflict some things onto yourself. I mean, I don't want to say this is true, of course, for all transition, because again, I think it can be a sign of authenticity for some, but there are so many parallels between the way eating disordered individuals kind of inflict control onto their own bodies, and the way gender dysphoric people inflict that control onto their bodies and also require the participation of others, to validate and their identity and that kind of thing. But this group think is something that I want to talk a little bit about, because this is something interesting with individuation, particularly in adolescence. There is a push and pull all the time between being an individual, looking at society and saying, I don't buy into that, but also looking desperately for a group where you belong.
Yeah.
And we talked about how that can be for intense children and intense individuals. And I want to read a quote here and kind of loop it all in together. So they're talking about highly gifted individuals and the sense of the better self. So it says, we have found, because most intense and gifted individuals have had little opportunity to experience this deep sort of friendship and sharing, they're so hungry for it. It is in adolescence that this deep need gets tangled in with urges for sexual experiences, which can lead to commitments and unions that become problematic in complex ways. Our experiences indicate that this need for sharing and friendship can be closely linked with the observed tendency for highly gifted individuals to take on the struggles of others at their own expense, supplanting their own growth for the desire to help another. So, a couple of things that I see is that exploration of sexual concepts might be a way for kids to feel more intimately connected with others. So if you say, I am asexual, and you meet someone else who says that too, not only are you tapping into the absolute privacy and intimacy of talking about sex and sexuality, but you're then connected with another person.
Yeah.
And when you get a lot of highly intense kids together in these online LGBT groups, what happens is they become kind of like surrogate therapists for one another, and what's more intense than being texted at like 4 a.m. by a kid who's saying, I might hurt myself, look at this picture of my cut, or, I mean, it does not get any more enmeshed than that. And so this kind of sense of belonging and closeness, it's like they've also kind of skipped all these steps to have the most intense intimacy ever, but it's not in a way that's necessarily adaptive.
Oh, yeah. And the idea of being asked for help, as an adolescent, I had an experience, I still remember like someone coming to me and like confiding in me because I had been like the weird kid and people didn't necessarily do that. And then someone did, and I was like, all right, like this is my favorite person now, because I'm going to help them. And this is going to be like, on the one hand, like it's great to want to help people, but if you're thrust into really heavy things right away, that's not where you want to start. Yeah. And that these intense kids are the ones finding each other. I mean, that's what happens in activism, and looking at There's a lot of hot washing going on right now. Maybe not enough reflection on within the Bernie Sanders campaign. Why did it not work? And some people who want to be more reflective and other people who don't. Like, that's just one example of something I'm in where there's a lot of intense people who care very much about, they have a mission and a drive to do it. But it's very hard to do that if you haven't first learned how to process your own feelings and why you're there.
Yeah.
That's where you got to start. Otherwise, you can't help other people. You can't run a movement, or the movement's going to be really toxic. And I think, like, coming back to, like, how do you know if you're going to thrive as a trans person who transitions? I mean, this is not going to answer it. Otherwise, people would have done it sooner. But it seems like a really important question to me is, if someone misgenders you or questions you or says, like, I don't see gender that way, can you say, like, okay, cool, man, like, you do you. I'm still confident in who I am. I feel a lot more confident about that person doing well, going forward. And that's not just for transgender questions. That's for so many things. Like, if you're really relying on someone else to affirm who you think you are, that's a dangerous position to put yourself in. Mm-hmm. And then if you have to supply someone else with that affirmation or else they fall apart, this is, again, we're getting into vicious circle territory, people pulling each other down instead of being able to help each other lift up.
It's interesting that you say that, because I've been really trying to think about this for a while. I mean, thinking about what is the typical kind of recommended pathway if someone is expressing some gender dysphoric symptoms, and, like, if it's a professional's job to assess whether or not transition is a good choice for them. Historically, we've looked at, like, let's say you have a natal female. We've looked at, well, how masculine is she? How much does a boy does she look like? And I've always thought, well, that's a dumb criteria. What we really need to be thinking about is psychological flexibility, which is exactly what you lifted up. Because that tells us something much more general about a person. How successful is this person at dealing with things when life doesn't go well?
Yeah.
Because transition isn't guaranteed to go any particular way. Mm-hmm. You don't know how it's going to turn out. So I'm so glad you lifted that up, because I've really been thinking about that a lot. And I guess the flip side of that is that's also dangerous, because that means that anybody who's really psychologically flexible should be completely free to pursue medical transition. And I'm not like a medicalist, so I don't believe in that perspective, but I definitely think that is a much more telling indicator of how successful someone will be in completely transforming their body from head to toe. that will help you know if they will handle it well.
It's not guaranteed to go well, but at least it's a place where there can be a red flag at the very least.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one thing about people is that we're not very good at predicting how happy things will make us.
Right. I've read some studies that say that. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Really interesting.
Well, we have covered so many things, Jessie. I really enjoyed this. I mean, I feel like we could have talked for like 45 more hours, but
it was a lot of fun, Sasha. Thank you for thinking you had anything to say. I'm a writer, so I don't have expertise, but maybe I've learned some stuff. So I love what you're putting out there. I think it's so important, and I just can tell that you're making an impact on these kids' lives that, it really matters. And that's really neat.
Jessie. Thank you. I mean, I think you have so much to say, and it's interesting because I've read so much of what you've written, but you are also really dynamic and charismatic, and you express yourself really beautifully with your face and your voice. And so it was just so awesome to be able to talk to you. And I'm sure that everybody who watches this interview is going to take a lot away from it. So thank you so, so much.
Thank you, Sasha.
All right, Jessie.
Everyone.
Yeah. Okay. Bye.
Bye.